Okay, boils and ghouls, you are listening to the 80s Slasher Librarian. I better return that book I borrowed from them. Their late fees are a killer.
If you enjoy the contents of the 80s Slasher Librarian YouTube channel and would like to sponsor the channel, then see the link in the description below for the Patreon page and start enjoying the benefits of being a patron of the 80s Slasher Librarian. And enjoy tonight's narration of Final Destination, Dead Man's Hand.
But remember, the risk of cheating the plan, of disrespecting the design, could incite a fury that could terrorize even the Grim Reaper. And you don't even want to fuck with that, Mac Daddy.
Final Destination, Dead Man's Hand, Chapter 2. Arlen Plug was death incarnate, at least according to his monthly bank account statements. Put a pair of dice in his hand, give him a questionable tip about an upcoming horse race, unwrap a fresh deck of playing cards within 15 feet of him, and you could practically hear his savings beg for mercy as their financial life was drained away, sometimes in a matter of hours. And it didn't help any that the city he'd chosen to make his home was Las Vegas, Nevada, the neon-brightened center of the gambling universe. Not that his finances were ever that healthy to start with. The last time Arlen had held a steady, good-paying job, the Berlin Wall was still up. But that was all right, as he often told the few people who ever showed an interest in him, usually just card dealers and fellow gamblers, and that was only because they had to put up with his stories as penance for taking his money. He was a simple guy with simple needs, he'd say. Give him a roof over his head and a couple square meals a day, and he was content. Whether he said it to convince them or himself was always the unspoken question, and one he had no real desire to answer. Still, he found ways to make ends meet, working the second shift at a 24-hour laundromat near the intersection of Industrial Road and New York Avenue. It was almost within spitting distance of the Stratosphere, the second tallest building in the city after construction on Merlin's Tower had wrapped up last year, right across the Strip. Arlen knew running a coin-operated laundry was about as close as he'd ever get to owning his own casino, and he played up the angle, if only to amuse himself. Everybody in this town played some sort of bigger-than-life role, after all, hid their true identities behind an entertainer's mask, so why should he be any different? So once Arlen started his shift at 5 p.m., he treated the patrons like guests, greeting them as they came in and thanking them for coming as they left, occasionally repeating the lame joke about how, unlike the Luxor or the Golden Nugget, the winnings at the Big Apple laundromat came in the form of clean clothes and fluffy sheets that smelled like springtime. Newcomers always smiled and thanked him for the attention. The regulars tended to ignore him and spent the hour or so it took to do their loads playing the nickel slots positioned near the front door. And when his shift was over at 1 a.m. and the neon lights of the city were fully competing with the moon and stars for dominance of the desert sky, Arlen handed the keys and the coin changer on his belt to the overnight manager, Bartolo Sanchez, then headed off to take advantage of a cheap dinner at Merlin's buffet line. A couple cups of coffee, some steak, mashed potatoes, no gravy but lots of butter, and a slice of apple pie, and he was fueled for the drive back to his apartment and a few hours of sleep. He'd usually get up around 6 or 7 and work his way over to the Strip to begin his other job, losing a fair amount of wages at the poker tables. When the money ran out, it was back to the apartment for a bite to eat, usually a bowl of instant ramen noodles and a nap, before it was time to head out to the laundromat. Then wash, rinse, repeat the cycle. Such were the exciting days and star-filled nights of Arlen Plug. It wasn't as if killing 8 hours in a laundromat was the first menial job he'd ever worked, though. He'd had enough experiences in his life, from gravedigger and dishwasher to motel manager and encyclopedia salesman, to know that he'd always find a way to pay the bills and have food on the table. That kind of I'll do anything within reason for a buck survival mentality had served him well enough all these years. Enough to finance the journey that took him cross-country from a rundown Jersey City apartment to an equally rundown Sin City motel room, and still end up with some coin in his pockets when he got there. The problem, though, was in keeping that coin in his pockets. The Meadows, what Las Vegas basically translated to from Spanish, was a town full of people looking to separate him from his cash, and not even Arlen Plug could resist the temptations they offered. The jackpots, the grand prizes, the large payouts. And like so many others before him, he truly believed that if he could catch that one big break, get dealt that one winning hand, pull down on that one golden lever, the pile of shit his life had amounted to thus far would magically turn to gold. But with the way his pursuit of Lady Luck had panned out up to this point, he could have been just as well served by staying in Jersey and pulling on his turnip night and day. It would have amounted to pretty much the same thing, except he'd be in control of how hard he was getting jerked. Well, at least the scenery was better in his new digs. If having a direct view into the bedroom of one of the few good-looking hookers left on East Fremont Street counted. Not that he was complaining. The Imperial probably sounded to tourists like a ritzy place to hang your hat when they came across its listing among Vegas's multitude of hotels and motels. And maybe it had been at some point. But to look at it now, you'd know right away the Dive hadn't seen any major renovations since the Rat Pack raised hell on the Strip, and the neighborhood surrounding it wasn't too far behind. Urban blight, it used to be called. And for a city that prided itself on its glamorous appearance, dumps like the Imperial were a major embarrassment, and a constant reminder that not all the makeup and boa feathers in the Meadows could hide every blemish on this aging showgirl of a town. The weather was nicer, too, if you could tolerate the withering daytime temperatures and the occasional 100-year flood. That was when the rain swept in from over the mountains to dump enough water on the city to flood the streets and turn the shopping mall at Caesar's Palace into a miniature recreation of Venice. For something that supposedly happened once a century, Arlen could count at least 2 times he'd been caught in one of those downpours during the decade he'd lived here. It was a wonder nobody had ever drowned when the highway underpasses filled with the runoff. And the rents were less stressful on the wallet, if you didn't mind living downtown, a crime-ridden area east of the northern end of Las Vegas Boulevard that seemed to rely on drug dealing and prostitution for income as much as the casinos depended on slot machines and blackjack. The mayor had been yammering for years about how he was going to clean up downtown, was going to convince the big casino owners and real estate developers to open brand new hotels and high-priced condominiums along East Fremont, was going to eliminate crime and drugs and prostitution, blah, blah, blah. The next mayor to get voted in would probably be promising the same damn things. It hadn't taken Arlen long to get the lay of the land once he'd found a place to call home. As the towering neon sign out front proclaimed, the Imperials specialized in daily, weekly, and monthly rentals, and offered air conditioning, switchboard, and free television. All the amenities a man could ask for in low-cost housing. Well, almost all the amenities. Better locks on the doors would have been nice. Arlen wound up replacing his after the second break-in cost him his DVD player, his boombox, and a six-pack of new socks he'd purchased the day before. He hadn't even got the chance to try them on. Complaining to the Imperial's management didn't do any good, and reporting it to the cops seemed like a waste of time. Besides, Las Vegas PD had more important things to focus on. According to the papers, members of Los Angeles' most notorious street gangs, the Crips and Bloods, often made weekend trips to Vegas to keep the Fremont Street trade going. Not that there ever seemed to be the slightest indication that sales might be dropping off. You couldn't walk 100 feet in any direction without running into a dealer asking if you were okay, if you were straight. And Arlen had learned to politely but firmly say yes in answer and move on, careful to avoid making eye contact, in case the action might be misinterpreted by the dealer and lead to a messy confrontation. Arlen certainly wasn't looking to become yet another crime statistic. There were already enough deaths in Vegas each year without adding another body to the morgue's coffers. As for the ladies of the night, the only places to find the really hot chicks were near the big hotels, and most of those girls wouldn't give a second glance to a bony, sallow-skinned guy with nicotine-stained teeth and a suit that went out of style when Miami Vice dropped out of syndicated reruns. Actually, that wasn't entirely true. They probably would give him a second look if he had a sizable bankroll to flash at them. Ugly is ugly, but throw enough cash at a hooker and even the most grotesque fucker can look like Prince Charming, if she squints really hard. Problem was, Arlen never had a wad so big he'd be able to find out what sort of corrective lenses Benjamin Franklin could buy on the Strip. Mostly, he and Andrew Jackson had to settle for the myopic second and third stringers who shuffled along Las Vegas Boulevard, offering a Fremont Street experience of a whole other kind. That's why it was such a pleasant surprise to discover one of his neighbors plied her trade just across from his apartment, and that she didn't look like some burned-out crack whore waiting for a fix. Tina, she called herself, not her real name, of course, and Arlen had fallen deeply in lust with her the moment he'd set eyes on her blue mini-dressed curves. He'd always had a thing for Asian girls. Why? He'd never been able to figure out. And this particular beauty had everything going for her. Great ass, nice titties, and a decent face. Didn't overdo the makeup, so she'd wind up looking like a cross between a circus clown and Tammy Faye Baker. Had chestnut brown hair that fell past her shoulders, and it didn't look like she used extensions or wore a wig. And she was tall. Tina probably had an inch on Arlen, even without the 3-inch soles on her boots that made her tower over him. She lived across the back courtyard from Arlen, and he'd always assumed she'd either never realized that curtains were meant to block nosy neighbors from spying on her private business, or just didn't give a shit if they watched. Maybe she got off on voyeurs, he figured. The sexual acrobatics she performed while working on some trick were definitely more interesting than a lot of the crap on TV. And watching a beautiful Asian woman in her late 20s, early 30s, dressed like a Japanese schoolgirl and going down on a guy with all the gusto of a starving man at a Nathan's hot dog eating contest just never seemed to lose its appeal. About 3 months after he moved in, he finally got to meet her. It happened in the lobby of the hotel. He was heading back to his apartment on a rare night off from work. She was standing near the front desk. He recognized her right away. She didn't, but then, most people rarely took notice of him. She asked if he'd like a little sucky-sucky, in probably one of the worst miso-horny Asian hooker voices he'd ever heard, and Arlen couldn't help but point it out. To his surprise, she hadn't gotten angry. She'd even laughed, as a matter of fact. She explained she put on the voice because most Johns wanted an exotic girl to fuck, and that had been the first thing to pop into her mind. It seemed to work, though. Arlen had been the first guy in 8 years to figure it out. But just because he'd seen through her play acting didn't mean he was any less inclined to take advantage of her offer. Andrew Jackson and his buddy Abe Lincoln made a short road trip from his wallet to her purse, and she spent the next 20 minutes on Arlen's payroll. There was no doubt about his choice of partner this time. This pro was all woman, and not a wig or hair extension in sight. It was the first time in quite a while that he'd actually felt like a winner, as pleasurably short-lived as the experience had been. Afterward, they chatted a bit as they tidied up. Tina didn't actually live at the hotel, which made a lot of sense. A smart pro, as Arlen knew, never brought a John home with her. There was always the chance something bad might happen if a guy knew too much about his date. Being stalked was a rarity among prostitutes, but it did happen now and then, usually with disturbing results. Not to Tina, though. She didn't live in the neighborhood, or so she said, and she had an arrangement with the Imperial's night manager, in exchange for a percentage of her take and the occasional pity fuck, her words. She got a room in which to conduct her business. It was an offer she found hard to turn down. Working the hotel kept her off the streets and thus off the radar of the vice squad. That her office faced Arlen's apartment, providing him with some free after-dinner entertainment, was just a coincidence. A happy coincidence, in his opinion, and about the luckiest thing to happen to him in... he couldn't remember how long. His luck hadn't improved all that much since then. "Had enough, Arlen?" It was close to noon, according to Arlen's watch. It was impossible to tell otherwise, since casinos like Merlin's didn't have clocks. All the better for them to keep you from realizing how long you'd been gambling and how quickly you'd lost your money. The other 6 players had moved on at various points during the morning, but still sitting at the other end of the poker table was a duded-up 30-something cowboy who called himself Texas Slim McMurtry. There was nothing slim about McMurtry, except maybe for how he liked his women, and if he was from Texas, then Arlen was the king of fucking Siam. The half-assed drawl Slim kept slipping out sounded like it had come from watching too many Yosemite Sam cartoons as a kid. The one time he said varmint in passing, Arlen had almost laughed in his face. He wasn't laughing now, though. The pot sitting in the middle of the table held $200 of his cash, and he was down to his last 50 in chips. He'd tried bluffing, tried raising the stakes in the blind hope Slim would back down and fold. But the cowboy hadn't flinched. Probably learned how to do that from watching Clint Eastwood westerns, or Maverick reruns. Sure, Arlen could have folded before things started getting out of hand, but he'd been doing pretty well in the early rounds. Well enough to be the only other survivor of his impromptu low-stakes tournament. And knowing when to fold 'em and walk away, as Kenny Rogers used to sing about, had never been one of his strengths. Besides, up until the last couple of hands, he'd almost convinced himself this was going to be his time to shine. That right there should have been a clear warning sign it was time to pack it in. Self-delusion was the first step in the downfall of every gambler, from Vegas to Monte Carlo. Having fallen into that trap as often as he did, one would think Arlen would have learned his lesson. But then, he'd never been the brightest kid in school. Arlen pushed the dark wraparound shades he always wore during games to hide his eyes, not to mention his startled reactions to getting dealt bad hands, back onto the bridge of his nose, and reached down to lift the edges of the 5 cards in front of him. He needn't have bothered to check them. They were the same suck-ass cards they had been when he first got a good look at them. Ace of spades, ace of clubs, 8 of spades, 8 of clubs, 9 of diamonds. Pretty much the same hand Wild Bill Hickok had been holding in Deadwood, South Dakota in 1876 when he got shot in the back of the head by the coward Jack McCall. The dead man's hand. Kind of appropriate for the last deal of the night, when you thought about it. "Arlen?" There was more than a hint of annoyance in Slim's voice now. He was starting to sound less like Yosemite Sam and more like Foghorn Leghorn. Arlen looked up and frowned. "Somewhere you gotta be in a hurry to, Slim?" The cowboy in the electric blue shirt and the scorpion-class string tie flashed a gold-capped tooth grin. "Well, a bathroom break sure would be nice. My bladder's been flexing its muscles pretty hard the last 10 minutes or so, I say." Arlen shrugged. "So go take a piss. I'll still be here when you get back." "Now that's right kindly of you, pardner," Slim said with a friendly nod. "But I got me a powerful feelin' this here showdown won't last more'n another minute. And once I collect my winnings, I can take all the time I want waterin' them there roses." Arlen sighed. Smug little bastard, isn't he? But he was right, and they both knew it. Sitting there and staring at his hand like a chump was only delaying the inevitable. Might as well just get it over with. Let the man go relieve the pressure in his bladder before it exploded. He tossed in his remaining chips. "Call." Slim dramatically laid out his cards on the green felt. Arlen felt a weight settle in his stomach. It was a still will. Ace of hearts, 2 of hearts, 3 of hearts, 4 of hearts, 5 of hearts. A 5 high straight. All of the same suit. Sure beat the shit out of Wild Bill's hand. Arlen sat back and pocketed his shades, watching silently as the female dealer slid the winnings over to the last man standing. The chips joined the mountain range that had formed on Slim's side of the table during the morning. The cowboy happily tossed a couple $100 chips to the woman, a nice tip for her services, but then he could afford to be generous. "Thank you, sir," she said. "No, thank you, Brenda," Slim replied. The gold teeth flashed brightly in the low-level lighting. "Y'all have a good day now. You hear?" Jerk, Arlen thought. If you're going to play at being a cowboy, you ought to at least get the fucking vocabulary right. Y'all is short for you all. A real cowboy wouldn't use it unless he was talking to a group, not just one person. Fucking Jed Clampett wannabe. Slim pushed back from the table and stood up. "Figure it's time for me to cash out in and mosey on back to my room." Arlen nodded. "Why press your luck, right?" "Well, I'd say the only thing that needs pressing is these here pants I'm a-wearing," Slim replied as he pointed to his rumpled slacks. "My luck's doing just fine." The sarcastic tone of the question apparently didn't get through to the cowboy's brain. Probably because of the shielding created by the 10-gallon Stetson he'd never taken off, even during bathroom breaks. As a chip runner came over to help collect the winnings, Slim walked around the table to address his opponent. "It was a right pleasure doing business with you, Arlen. Y'all really got me worried there a few times. I even thought about cutting and running once or twice, I say. Until the cards started going my way, that is. Guess that's just how the wind blows sometimes, don't it?" "Guess so," Arlen said tightly. "I'd consider it an honor to lock horns with you some other time. And who knows? Maybe next time you'll be the one comes out on top." He extended his hand. Cocksucker, Arlen thought, putting on his best false smile. It's always easy to say shit like that when you're not the one getting your ass handed to you. Not that he'd ever known what that felt like. Yeah, right. Still, he grudgingly shook hands. Arlen Plug might have been the king of all losers, but he wasn't going to show he was a poor sport. There wasn't much reason to hang around the casino after that. He wasn't completely busted, but when it came to a choice between spending his last few bucks on lunch or sliding it in a quarter form down the throat of one of the slots, his stomach always won out. Well, almost always. Arlen walked away from the table, ignoring the dirty look Brenda the poker dealer cut him. What, a $200 tip wasn't enough, he wondered. Greedy bitch. Hopefully she'd use the money to buy herself a better attitude. Doubtful, though. The casino floor was quickly starting to fill up as old ladies with ugly, pastel-colored outfits and with even uglier demeanors moved along the ranks of slots they'd each commandeered for the day's activities. And God help the man or woman dumb enough to try sitting down at one of those reserved one-armed bandits. They found out soon enough how quick on the draw some of those old ladies could be with their tongues. And they'd only get the one warning before the screaming started, about how the old dear was working that particular machine, how they weren't going to rob her of a jackpot. The money was going to come pouring out of the thing any minute now, and she'd be goddamned if anyone was going to walk away with her hard-earned money. Lesson number 1 in Las Vegas: never fuck with Grandma when she's got the fever. The row upon row of slot machines comprised the outer circle of the gambling maze called Merlin's Tower. The center was where the big games were played: poker, blackjack, roulette, and the like. That's usually where you'd find most of the men, although women's interest in card games had dramatically picked up in the last few years. It probably had a lot to do with all those poker tournament shows that had popped up on cable TV. A game that takes an hour to learn and a lifetime to master, the broadcasters always said. Arlen figured he'd get around to the mastering part when he started his second lifetime. God knew he'd wasted away his first one trying to figure it out. It just seemed a damn shame he didn't believe in reincarnation. It took him about 10 minutes to cross the tower's cavernous gambling hub and reach the entrance to the Round Table, the casino's dining hall. The trip involved a lot of weaving around the boggle-eyed tourists stunned by all the flashing lights and ringing bells and screeching sirens, the frat boys waiting for night to fall so they could get drunk and get laid, not necessarily in that order, and the occasional kid running loose while mommy and daddy flushed the vacation money down the toilet. And just whose bright idea was it, Arlen wondered, to portray Vegas as a family-friendly place anyway? It was a gambling town, for Christ's sake, and it wasn't nicknamed Sin City for nothing. There were all-nude reviews both on and off the Strip, a growing number of gentlemen's clubs scattered around the city, and practically on every corner there was one of those freebie newspaper dispensers. Only these weren't offering penny-saver discounts on used washing machines or cars, but listings for the multitude of escort services that existed just outside of Vegas proper. If that wasn't enough, you could always drive a few miles away from the bright lights into the Nevada desert communities where prostitution was legal and blow your wad both financially and sexually. And this was where people wanted to bring their kids? The Round Table was pretty much like any other all-you-can-eat casino feed bag. Colorful banners of red and blue and yellow hung from the thick wooden rafters. Tapestries, actually digital scans of real paintings that had been blown up on a computer and printed out on huge canvases, decorated the fake stone walls. Torches stuck out from metal rings set in the walls, but the flames that flickered in them were just strips of red and yellow tissue paper with small fans beneath them blowing upward. The wooden dining tables were long enough to seat a dozen people or so, with benches running the full length of them. Basically, they were just oversized picnic tables, but most folks were probably so taken in by the ambience that they never realized it. Busboys and the occasional waitress, all dressed in period costumes, moved around the hall, clearing tables and making sure the guests were enjoying their meals. The centerpiece of the Round Table was its massive buffet area. At times it seemed as though every dish known to man could be found there, although the giant mutton leg slowly rotating on a spit above the spread was just a plastic display. And for $8, including tax, paid before you got to the food, a better bargain was hard to find. Only thing was, you needed to get there early enough and hope the stuff you liked hadn't already been gobbled up by the starving masses, eager to get back to their games of chance. At this point, however, Arlen was just hungry enough to be willing to settle for chucked steak and those hardened, waxy little roasted potatoes everybody seemed to avoid. He couldn't afford to be choosy on his budget. He grabbed one of the oversized gray-colored plastic trays from the stack near the door and joined the slow conga line of patrons that led down the winding ramp to the cashier. Eventually, his turn came, and he shuffled forward to pay. The cashier knew him on sight. About the only thing he knew about her was her name, and that was because it was printed on her ID badge. "Hey, Arlen," she said as he stepped up. He nodded pleasantly. "Hey, Socorro." She was the kind of Latin woman you figured must have been pretty hot-looking in her glory days, but 20 years, 40 pounds, and X number of kids later, it had all gone to hell. The ring squeezed onto her third finger showed she was still married, so obviously her husband still found her attractive, in a Roseanne Barr kind of way. Arlen put his tray down in front of the cash register. Socorro raised an inquisitive eyebrow. "Buffet special?" He coughed out a sharp, slightly embarrassed laugh. "Well, you know me." "You and everybody else on this line." She punched the keys on the register, adding up the total. $8. Arlen pulled his wallet from the inner breast pocket of his jacket and flipped it open. A $5 bill and a coupon for a free lap dance at the Stallion Stable Strip Club were all to be found inside. Socorro glanced at the contents. "I don't think that's going to cover it." "God damn it," he muttered. Arlen sighed and put the wallet back, then picked up the tray. "Next time, I guess." "I guess," she agreed. Socorro nodded toward the door. "Maybe you should try the stable. I hear the strippers serve crab every day." She smiled broadly and winked. Arlen grinned sheepishly. "Thanks. I'll keep it in mind." He turned and made his way up the ramp, trying to act politely as he fought against the current of grumbling diners. With the final shove, he squeezed through the doors, restacked his tray, and began walking back across the casino. This time in the direction of the underground parking garage and his 1984 Monte Carlo. He shook his head. Just another day in the life of Arlen Plug. Down on his luck gambler. A 3-course meal of crow, topped off with a cold slice of financial reality for dessert. He sighed again. Well, at least he had enough cash to buy a cup of coffee to wash it all down with. Chapter 3. Shauna Ingalls hated cats. Not the house variety, after all. A tortoiseshell named Jolly and a stray black Tom named A-Rod shared her apartment in Henderson, 8 miles outside Vegas. But the big cats, tigers, lions, panthers, jaguars, the massive SOBs you'd see on the Animal Planet channel, tearing into a caribou or zebra or whatever the hell it was that they ate on those nature shows. She hadn't always felt that way, but that was before she had to work with them. Strut around a Las Vegas stage in nothing more than a G-string and a pair of high heels, white sharp-claw predators stalk around you, and you become acutely aware of your vulnerability and your mortality. When she left her hometown of Carson City, Nevada 4 years ago, Shauna was a fresh-faced 19-year-old brunette with dreams of being a dancer in one of the big revues on the Strip. Circus, maybe, or one of those shows where the dancers always look so glamorous in their feathers and sequins and glittering colorful costumes. 6 months later, the now blonde Mystique was working an afternoon shift at the oh-so-cleverly named Shakes Gentlemen's Club off Bridger Avenue in the downtown section of the city, and about the only clothes she wore consisted of stiletto-heeled boots, a bright blue thong, and a matching pair of pasties over her nipples. The addition of the cowboy hat and the little bandit mask had been her idea. After seeing Antonio Banderas in The Mask of Zorro, she thought it would add a level of mystery to her act to go with her stage name. As it turned out, the only mystery in which the patrons were interested was how much it would cost them to get more than a private lap dance in the back room, a little something she could do for them in exchange for a sizable tip. If those customers had been Orlando Bloom or Johnny Depp or Ewan McGregor, she might have considered it, even though acts of prostitution were illegal within Vegas city limits. Hey, how often does a girl get a chance to bump nasties with Hollywood royalty, right? But since the body types of Shake's clientele had more in common with Randy Quaid than Dennis Quaid, she politely declined the cash offers, then remarked she wouldn't mind if they bought her another champagne cocktail. No reason to blow them off completely and embarrass them, she figured, and sometimes just having a pretty girl to talk to was enough to make a guy happy. Besides, champagne cocktails cost $8 apiece, so she was still bringing extra cash into the club without having to whore herself out. The lack of interest in her dancing talent didn't faze her, though. She still had her dream, and she knew how hard it was for a dancer to find work in this even harder town. You made do with what you could until the opportunity arose to move on to the next level. In the end, though, dreams could come true if you really wanted them to, badly enough. At least that's what it said in the movies. When she heard about the construction of Merlin's Tower, Shauna knew it would only be a matter of time before the call went out for dancers. After all, what was a hotel casino in this town without some kind of review? And when that day finally arrived, about 6 months before the tower was scheduled to open, Shauna walked out of Shakes and never looked back. She was that confident her dream was about to come true. Even though more than 200 other girls stood on line with her the first day, each with dreams of their own. Magapalooza was to be the name of the tower show, and it was described to them as a spectacle bigger than Siegfried and Roy. showier than showgirls of magic, and more explosive than the Mirage's volcano. A lot of hyperbole, to be sure, but everything in Las Vegas was meant to look and sound bigger than life. That's how you got people in the seats. A show that didn't bill itself as having a grand scale equaled only by the Second Coming was a show that wouldn't survive for long, given the fierce competition presented by the other hotels. The trick for producers was in making sure it lived up to its hype. Being chosen to become one of those minimally attired dancers involved a lot of hard work, but hard work had never scared Shauna. The audition process, during which scores of girls were dropped at the end of each round, seemed endless, but Chip Monek, the company manager, and Dory Youngblood, the dance captain, liked what they saw in her. They thought she'd be perfect for the tiller line, the high kick line right up front in the show. Its positions assigned only to the most beautiful and talented dancers. The producer, Milos Hutson, was only interested in two things: if she had a problem going topless, and if she'd lose the blonde dye and go back to her natural hair color. Another L'Oreal girl who didn't need. She told him she had no hesitations about meeting either request. It would certainly cut down on her peroxide expenses. And just like that, she was in. The dream had finally come true. In Vegas, they call that beginner's luck. It usually doesn't last for long. She found that out a couple days later, after the final selections had been made. That was when Milos explained how, as part of the show, the dancers would be sharing the stage with dangerous animals. 2 lions, 2 panthers, and 3 tigers. Shauna didn't like the idea of being that close to 4-legged carnivores without a protective fence between her and them, and finally had to admit her fears to Milos. Oh, sure, they were highly trained, and yes, she knew the cats would always be paraded around on leashes, held by equally well-trained handlers in costumes, but a lion was a lion no matter how much you taught it tricks, and in the right frame of mind, a 5'7", 120-pound brunette was just another potential meal in its eyes. She expected him to cut her from the show right then and there, and put a quick end to her dream. She began to wonder if she could still get her old job back at Shakes. But after a few moments of consideration, Milos simply told her to get over it and get back to work, then walked away. It was the Mayo brothers who managed to convince her she was in no danger. Oriel and Oliver were the stars of Magapalooza. It was their concept, and they would be switching between playing Palin and Resch from one performance to the next, and the ones primarily responsible for training the big cats. They were Brazilian, both tall and dark-skinned, and drop-dead gorgeous, with builds like Olympic track stars. Uriel was the oldest of the two, and the most laid back, with an easy, inviting smile and incredible gray-green eyes. Oliver was only 2 years younger, but his serious demeanor at times made it appear as if he was the older, more responsible one. He, too, was playgirl material, and the soul patch under his bottom lip and the dark blue, almost black color of his eyes hinted at the type of dangerous nature lying within, that innumerable women the world over no doubt had found unbelievably sexy. Shauna certainly had, which explained why she'd so eagerly agreed to the brothers' offer to introduce her to the animals. She'd appreciated the attention, much to the consternation of the other girls, but in the end she'd only come away with the names of her potential hunters and the nagging fear that one day she might become the Blue Plate Special. She didn't quit, though. Just because she was scared shitless every time one of those beasts roared, it didn't mean she was going to walk away from an opportunity of a lifetime and allow some other girl to take her place. She wasn't an idiot. And by the time a year had passed and she had performed with the cats 6 times a week in over 300 shows, sick days not really allowed in her profession, Shauna finally learned to relax around them. Not enough to let her guard down when they prowled near her, of course. Again, she wasn't an idiot, but enough that her heart would stop leaping into her throat when they ventured a bit too close for her liking. Because after all, animals can always sense fear. The alarm clock buzzed and Shauna rolled over to shut it off. 11 a.m. and the start of another wonderfully beautiful day. She stretched, arcing her back in an unconscious imitation of the very animals that troubled her, then stopped as she felt someone watching her. She glanced at the other side of the bed. Jolly and A-Rod sat on top of the rumpled sheets, quietly eyeing her. "Good morning," Shauna said lightly. Jolly yawned, A-Rod stretched and said something. "Anyone up for brunch?" Shauna asked. Both house cats jumped off the bed and immediately trotted off to the kitchen. Shauna grinned. Who said animals didn't understand when you spoke to them? Obviously, that person had never owned a pet, or been owned by one. The boys had grown quite upset by the time she stepped out of the shower and slipped into a pink-colored silk robe. If their loud meows were any indication, that is. To Shauna, it was proof positive animals were smarter than people generally thought. She'd offered the cats food, and now they were annoyed their orders hadn't been taken. "I'm sorry, guys," she apologized, "but not all of us can get by with just licking ourselves clean." She ignored the bored-sounding response she got from her customers and moved across the room to the cabinet over the microwave oven. Like most kitchens in the apartment complex in which she lived, it was not really a place for eating, being no wider than the aisle of an average bodega. On one side, a refrigerator was crammed into a far corner. Near the window, with its view of Las Vegas in the distance, a small electric stove sat next to it. On the other side were a sink and a Formica counter that ran the length of the room. Above and below the counter, and mounted on the wall beside the stove, were a number of cabinets holding pots, pans, dishes, and foods of both human and feline varieties. Shauna opened the cabinet and studied the various cans of Fancy Feast and 9 Lives. "So what'll it be, boys?" she called over her shoulder. "Tuna or beef?" She turned her head to look back at the furry diners. A-Rod tilted his head to one side and meowed softly. Shauna nodded. "One of each, right." She took down the food and carried it to the electric can opener that stood beside the toaster at the near end of the counter, then set about opening the cans. The contents went into 2 small plastic bowls that barely made it to the pink and white tiled floor before the cats were tearing into them. A-Rod, being the older, preferred beef, Jolly settled for a fish buffet. Her customers taken care of, Shauna walked back to the bedroom to get dressed for her trip to the gym. Today's outfit consisted of a pair of white cotton sweatpants, white trainers, and a white t-shirt, emblazoned with the words "Property of the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department" in dark blue lettering. That had been a gift from her boyfriend Warren, a homicide detective she'd hooked up with last year. When he'd given it to her 3 months ago, he joked it was to break up the monotony of those Hello Kitty t-shirts she owned. Shauna smiled as she ran a hand over the shirt. She and Warren seemed to live at opposite ends of the spectrum. She in the bright lights and opulence of the Strip, he in the shadows and crime of the city's streets. Not exactly the kind of relationship she would have expected to work out, even if you ignored the 20-year age difference. But something had definitely clicked the day they met at Buffalo Bill's resort in the desert. She'd driven the 45 miles to Primm, Nevada, that day because she'd always loved roller coasters, and the Desperado ranked right up there with the best of ones she'd ever ridden. It was one of the tallest and fastest in the world, with the few spots during the ride where you actually felt like you were going to float right out of your seat restraints. Shauna loved a good-natured scare every now and then, and the Desperado never disappointed her. Unfortunately, she'd had to make the trip to the amusement park alone, because none of the other girls in Magapalooza were all that fond of the notion of dropping from great heights at 90 miles per hour, or potentially spending the drive back to Vegas hanging out the passenger window and puking out their guts. Bunch of wussies. So there she stood on the line, waiting for her chance to climb aboard the next available car, when she noticed the guy directly ahead of her. Tall, dark, and handsome. Regular guy handsome, not Hollywood star handsome. But then, real pretty-looking guys tended to be too high maintenance for her liking. They were too wrapped up in themselves, too inclined to raise hell when they hit the town for the evening. And of course, it almost never failed that you wound up defending your claim on him against other women, either ones looking to elbow you out of the way, or ones he was trying to pick up when he thought you weren't paying attention. The outcome was always pretty much the same: Either you got into a shouting match with the other girl, telling the bitch to back off, or the guy was suggesting a threesome in his hotel room. The man in front of her, the desperado, however, was different. He was alone, for one thing, and had an intense quality to him that no pretty boy she'd ever dated had seemed to possess, like an aura of strength that seemed to radiate from him. Her gaze went right to the third finger on his left hand. No wedding band. Well, that had made him look even better. And then his back stiffened a bit, as though he was suddenly aware that someone was staring at him. Slowly he turned around to face her. Love at first sight, and damned if she hadn't known it the moment she saw that rugged jaw and those piercing blue eyes. He'd known it too. She could tell by the look on his face. It was like an electrical current had run through her body when he smiled at her. She'd felt tingly inside, and the skin on her arms got all goose-pimpled. "Hey," he'd said. "Hey," she'd replied. Of such witty conversation openings are romances born. Guys tended to stare at her breast, but when Warren looked at her, he focused on her face, not her boobs. And while they spoke, the line moving ever closer to the coaster, he'd managed to maintain that eye contact most of the time. He wasn't blind, after all, and it wasn't like the bright pink baby doll t-shirt she'd been wearing was designed to hide anything. They discussed careers. Okay, so he'd stared real hard at her breast when the word dancer came up, but she'd quickly explained it didn't mean she was a stripper. Well, not anymore, and their mutual love of roller coasters. She'd been impressed that he was a member of the Coaster Kings, a nationwide organization of roller coaster enthusiasts that made trips around the country solely for the sheer pleasure of sampling new and old rides. He even offered to help get her into the group. When they finally reached the front of the line, Warren had been the one to suggest sitting together in the first car. A good thing he did, too. She would have knocked him down if he'd tried to hog it all to himself. Shauna shook her head, grinning at the memory of that awkward first date. She still sometimes found it hard to believe things had worked out so well between them. None of her prior relationships had lasted past the 6-month mark. It must have been fate, she told herself. After all, who'd ever think sharing a seat on a roller coaster could wind up changing two lives just like that? She sighed and tucked the t-shirt into her sweatpants, then glanced at the clock. 11:40 a.m. "Oh, crickets," she muttered. She needed to get a move on if she was going to get in her workout and a few laps in the fitness center's pool. She tossed her iPad, a bath towel, and a bright red one-piece swimsuit in her gym bag, added a bottle of body wash for the shower afterward, then hurried to the kitchen for a bottle of water and a Nutri-Grain cereal bar. A-Rod and Jolly, she noted, made no attempt to get out of the way as she dance-hopped around them to get her supplies from the cabinets. Having devoured their brunch, they were apparently content to lie on the kitchen floor and soak up a few rays from the light spilling through the window. If they were aware of how annoying it was for Shauna to detour around a couple of furry roadblocks, they made no attempt to show it. Shauna wove her way back out and grabbed the car keys and a cell phone from the living room coffee table on her way to the front door. "Try not to wreck the place while I'm out, guys," she called to the cats. "I'll be back around 1. Jolly waved a paw in her direction, but Shauna couldn't be certain if he was waving goodbye or motioning for her to get the hell out of his apartment. It didn't matter, she thought with a smile as she closed the door. It was going to be another beautiful day in Las Vegas, and nothing was going to spoil it for her. Okay, Slashaholics, this has been chapters 2 and 3 of Final Destination, Dead Man's Hand. So, we had to know going into this that, books can't play out like movies, and you have to get a lot more backstory for your characters to form more of a connection with them. So what do you guys think of Arlen and Shauna? Between the two of them, I feel like I can relate more to Arlen, but then again, I've never been a showgirl in Vegas, so I can't really relate to Shauna there. But, it's cool that she loves her cats, and she seems like part homebody, but still has like a reckless side, but still she's smart enough to, put up safeguards. I'm curious to see the character development with her, and I feel like her boyfriend / homicide detective is going to be pretty busy during this book. I haven't read this book yet, so I'm not sure if that's a proper prediction or not, but it just seems that way, some foreshadowing there, that her boyfriend just happens to be, Warren was his name, right? That he just happens to be a homicide detective. But I gotta say, I'm more interested in seeing the character development for Arlen. He seems like a really, really cool character that's going to have a lot of sides to him, and I can't wait to see where they're crossing paths. Do they already know each other? Are they going to be part of Death's design, I can't wait to find out. And I'll be back very soon with more of Final Destination, Dead Man's Hand. Before we end it tonight, I want to say thank you to our sponsors of tonight's upload. From the Patreon page, Sean Campbell, Carl Eakins, and Catherine McClear. Thank you so much for supporting this channel through Patreon. Really appreciate you. And as I said at the beginning of the upload tonight, if anybody else would like to become a patron of this channel, we have tiers that start out as low as $5 per month, and some awesome benefits for being a patron and sponsoring the channel. The link to the Patreon page is in the description below. Alright guys, until next time, this has been your friendly neighborhood 80s slasher librarian saying, thanks for listening, and
I'll see you soon.